In 2021, the American boating world celebrated what looked like a triumphant comeback. Outboard engines were selling faster than factories could build them. Dealers couldn't keep inventory in stock. Waiting lists stretched for months. Industry analysts called it a renaissance, a cultural revival, a return to the golden era of life on the water. But beneath the headlines, beneath the glossy marketing and full marinas, something else was happening. Something slow, quiet, and dangerous. The very foundation the industry relied on was starting to crack. And now, just a few short years later, the consequences are visible everywhere. Inventory lots are full. Dealers are shutting down. Manufacturers are restructuring debt in silence. 4 iconic brands that once defined American boating now face a future that is anything but certain. To understand how we got here, you have to look back to when boating in America wasn't a luxury hobby. It was part of everyday life. After World War II, when families moved to the suburbs and the idea of the weekend became part of American identity, lakes and rivers became meeting places. Outboards were not complicated machines back then. They were loud, oily, mechanical companions. Simple enough for a high school kid to tear down and rebuild with a few tools in the garage. Owners didn't just operate their engines, they understood them. Manuals were written in plain language. Diagrams were drawn for people, not technicians. A problem on the water was not a disaster. It was an invitation to tinker. Names like Mercury, Johnson, and Evinrude were spoken with the same respect reserved for beloved truck models or baseball teams. They represented freedom. Saturday mornings started with the smell of gasoline and fresh coffee. Engines coughed to life. Kids pushed away from the dock, and laughter echoed across the water. This was boating when boating was simple. But no golden age lasts forever. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, scientists began warning that the haze of blue smoke drifting across American lakes wasn't harmless nostalgia. It was pollution. New environmental rules were coming, whether manufacturers were ready or not. And while the American companies were busy selling heritage and horsepower, engineers in Japan at Yamaha, Honda, and Suzuki were quietly building a different kind of outboard. Cleaner, quieter, smoother. They watched the United States market carefully, waiting for the moment when regulation, consumer preference, and precision engineering would align. For a long time, the American brands held on. Tradition is a powerful anchor, but while history can inspire loyalty, it can also blind an industry to the storms gathering on the horizon. The boating world did not collapse overnight. The decline began slowly, in increments. One design decision, one economic shift, one regulatory change at a time. What we are witnessing today is not a sudden disaster. It is the final stage of a long unraveling. The unraveling became unmistakable in the late 1990s when the industry faced its first true crossroads. New emissions regulations were no longer distant proposals. They were now law. The old, smoky two-stroke engines that powered generations of family weekends would have to evolve. For Outboard Marine Corporation, the parent company of Johnson and Evinrude, this was not just a technical challenge. It was a defining test, and they believed they had the answer. A next-generation direct injection two-stroke that would run cleaner without giving up power. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it became one of the most destructive missteps in the history of recreational marine engines. At its launch, the new system promised better fuel economy, lower emissions, and a smoother ride. Dealers were excited. Marketing campaigns were bold. Brochures spoke of innovation, legacy, and engineering breakthroughs. But when these engines were put into service, problems surfaced. At real docks, real lakes, and with real owners, the truth emerged quickly. Engines stalled unexpectedly. Sensors failed. Fuel systems clogged. The engines that were supposed to save the industry began stranding customers in the middle of lakes. Warranty claims surged. Dealers faced furious buyers they had to reassure without answers. Technicians struggled to diagnose issues that even factory service departments couldn't fully explain. By 1999, the financial strain was crushing. Warranty costs were no longer routine. They were catastrophic. Millions were poured into repairs, replacements, recalls, legal settlements, and public relations efforts designed to stop the bleeding. Outboard Marine Corporation had spent decades building trust. Now that trust was evaporating in months. And when trust disappears in boating, it doesn't just dent sales. It reshapes the entire market. Customers don't forget the day an engine dies on the water. The collapse that followed was enormous. Outboard Marine Corporation, once a titan of American boating culture, filed for bankruptcy. Thousands of jobs disappeared. Dealerships closed. Entire regional economies felt the shock. And perhaps the most lasting damage of all, the industry learned to fear innovation. Major manufacturers became cautious to the point of paralysis, terrified that one bold engineering mistake could end their company. From that point forward, risk was something to avoid, not manage. Meanwhile, Yamaha and Honda did not stop. They had been preparing for this moment. Their four-stroke designs, refined, efficient, reliable, were no longer alternatives. They were now the standard. And a reputation, once lost in the marine world, rarely comes back. A generation of boaters grew up hearing the same quiet phrase from dockside mechanics and marina old-timers. If you want reliability, buy Japanese. The aftermath of that shift created a new landscape. American brands clung to identity, tradition, and legacy imagery. Japanese brands offered consistency, engineering, and quiet competence. The market did not flip overnight, but the trust moved. And trust is the true currency of boating. What came next did not just change engine design. It changed how boats were bought, financed, stored, serviced, and valued. The next chapter in this story would be fueled not by engineering failure, but by economic illusion. The illusion began during one of the most chaotic periods in recent memory. In 2021, while the world reeled from lockdowns, remote work, shuttered travel, and a collective hunger for escape, boating suddenly became the perfect answer. Families who once vacationed overseas now looked to the nearest lake. People who had never stepped foot on a dock began searching for used bow riders, pontoons, and center consoles. Outboard engines, once a seasonal product with predictable sales cycles, became the hottest commodity in recreational America. Demand did not just increase, it exploded. Dealers who had struggled through lean years suddenly found themselves at the center of a feeding frenzy. Buyers would call from multiple states away, offering to place deposits sight unseen. Engines were sold before they even arrived at the dealership. Used boats sold at prices higher than new ones. The entire market flipped upside down. It felt as though the golden age had returned, but turbocharged. Yet what looked like a healthy boom was something very different. It was a demand shock fueled by stimulus checks, cheap loans, and the psychological need to reclaim a sense of freedom. Economists tried to warn that this was temporary, but optimism is a strong drug, and the industry was desperate for growth. So dealers did what they had always been encouraged to do. They ordered more inventory, a lot more. This is where the floor plan system became a trap. Most dealerships do not own the engines and boats sitting on their lots. They borrow money to stock that inventory. Dealers financed inventory, paying back those loans when the products are sold. In normal times, When inventory turns quickly, this is a manageable system. But in 2021, dealers assumed the sales pace would continue forever. They doubled and tripled their orders. Manufacturers, thrilled to see numbers spike, rewarded this behavior with incentives and volume discounts. Lenders loosened terms. The entire system inflated itself on the assumption that the boom was real and lasting. But when restrictions lifted and travel returned, boating demand didn't gradually decline. It dropped sharply. The people who bought boats in 2021 weren't long-term boaters. They were temporary participants filling a social and psychological gap. Once life normalized, many of them stepped away. And just like that, the demand wave that everyone had mistaken for a new era evaporated. But the inventory didn't. Across the country, dealership lots filled with engines and boats that had already been paid for with borrowed money. Floor plan interest climbed month after month. What had once been a profitable tool now became financial quicksand. Every day that inventory sat in storage, it cost more. And when interest rates began rising in 2022, the pressure turned brutal. A single month of payments could wipe out a dealer's entire profit margin. The frenzy that made everyone feel brilliant in 2021 had now turned into an unpayable debt cycle. The industry hadn't just ridden a wave. They had mistaken a riptide for safe water. What happened next was not a slowdown. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The reckoning began with silence. Not dramatic press releases or factory shutdowns, just subtle changes. Engines staying in crates longer, salespeople making more follow-up calls than usual, and dealership owners spending more time in private meetings. The numbers stopped making sense long before the first bankruptcy filings appeared. Inventory that once churned every 30 to 60 days started aging past 180, then 270, then a year or more. And once an engine sits that long, its value is no longer determined by its manufacturer's suggested retail price, but by its desperation price. Floor plan loans, once a convenience, became a countdown clock. The longer inventory sat, the more interest accumulated. When interest rates jumped from around 4% to over 10% in just 2 years, those clocks began ticking faster. Some dealers now owed more in loan payments each month than they earned in sales. It did not matter how well a boat was built or how reliable an engine was. Those engines were now liabilities, not assets. The breaking point came when dealers began dipping into out-of-trust territory. Out-of-trust sales happen when a dealer sells a boat or engine but does not immediately pay back the lender who financed it. It is a move born from desperation. Sell now, pay later, hope the market rebounds. But once a lender sees this behavior, the hammer comes down fast. Credit is frozen. Inventory is seized. Receivers are appointed to liquidate assets. Doors close overnight. This is exactly what happened to several of the largest multi-state dealership networks in the country. Their collapse didn't just wipe out businesses. It flooded the market with thousands of discounted engines and boats sold at liquidation auctions. And that forced every dealership still standing to compete with prices no sane business model could match. It was a chain reaction, a pressure wave that rolled across the marine industry. Meanwhile, the customer's experience changed just as dramatically. A decade ago, an outboard engine was something you could maintain yourself. You could troubleshoot it with basic tools, a printed manual, and a Saturday afternoon. Now, engines are integrated electronic systems with encrypted diagnostics, proprietary software, and required dealer service cycles. Even routine maintenance often requires special tools and digital resets. This shift wasn't accidental. Manufacturers designed engines to be serviced at dealerships, not home garages. It created a revenue stream, but also a dependency. For many boaters, The freedom that once defined the experience has been replaced with cost, scheduling, and frustration. When engines break today, the owner can't fix them. And when repair bills come, and they do, they come with four-figure price tags. So as prices rose, as financing tightened, as resale values collapsed, something deeper happened. Trust eroded. And trust is the one thing in boating you cannot buy, manufacture, or discount your way into. You either have it or you don't. The collapse wasn't just economic, it was emotional. And from here, the storm only moves upstream to the manufacturers themselves. The manufacturers now stand in the center of a shrinking market that was once assumed to be permanent. These are companies built on scale, on the belief that production lines must run continuously, that capacity must grow, that innovation must be visible and frequent. But the problem is simple. The system they built assumes demand that no longer exists. And unlike dealers who can liquidate inventory and close their doors, manufacturers are tethered to massive factories, global supply contracts, research programs, and shareholders expecting growth. Mercury, the single biggest name in the US outboard market, carries the weight of decades of investment in American production. The brand has built sprawling facilities and supply chains optimized for volume, not slowdowns. When demand stalls, those factories don't stop costing money. Each quiet conveyor belt has a price. Every engine stored in a warehouse has a carrying cost. And every month that sales do not match expenses, the walls close in a little tighter. If the downturn lasts through 2026, the pressure to cut production or close plants may become unavoidable. Yamaha faces a different, but equally dangerous problem. For years, the company has tried to position itself at the cutting edge of marine propulsion. Hybrids, electrics, experimental battery systems. The technology is promising, but still expensive, heavy, and difficult to scale. The next era everyone promised has not arrived yet. Development costs continue to rise, supply chains remain unstable, and dealers are already struggling to sell what is sitting in their warehouses. Innovation without adoption becomes debt. Yamaha cannot afford to chase a future the market is not ready to pay for. Suzuki is loved for reliability, but brand loyalty cannot sell engines into a market with fewer buyers. Their dealer network is smaller, their marketing presence weaker. When buyers vanish, visibility becomes survival. Suzuki risks being squeezed out, not because of product failure, but because volume matters more than quality in a contracting market. Survival now depends on whether Suzuki can convince first-time and budget-conscious buyers to return at a time when consumer confidence is fragile. Honda's challenge is philosophical. Marine engines are a small slice of a corporation powered by automotive and motorcycle. Revenue. When economic pressure intensifies, corporate strategy doesn't ask which division is beloved. It asks which division is unessential. If the US outboard market continues shrinking, a quiet withdrawal from the marine segment becomes not just possible, but rational. And while these manufacturers face diverging pressures, their future converges on a single question. What happens when the price of boating rises faster than the value people place on it? The used market has already given us the answer. Listings are up, values are down, families are walking away. Engines that once symbolized adventure now symbolize debt. A pastime once built on simplicity now feels engineered for complexity. The collapse is not loud. It is slow, steady, structural. The water is still calm on